All right, let's get into the tough conversation. On Friday night, MLS made an announcement that all first teams from MLS will be required to bypass and withdraw from the U.S. Open Cup and send their reserve teams there instead. The backlash by this decision is something that Don Garber has been trying to do since day one. It united anti-MLS Euro snobs, anti-MLS USMNT dweebs, and MLS diehard lifers into one unifying message. This decision sucks. As we continue on with this conversation, it is important to ask the questions and rationalize the decision best we can in order to avoid pitchforks and torches in the street, which is kind of what's going on Twitter right now. I think it's important to talk about the history and understand that this decision isn't completely unprecedented. In the intro, I mentioned that it was almost unprecedented. In the 1920s, the ASL were considered one of the best leagues in the world, the American Soccer League. They were recruiting players from all over Europe to play in their league to the point where they were getting European leagues so angry that they were stealing their players away that they had FIFA go and try and sanction the ASL for stealing players. How dare an American league be able to recruit? I know. They cited schedule congestion and pulled out of the National Challengers Cup, which is that time's version of the US Open Cup, and they barred any team from the ASL from entering. In response, a few teams split from that decision. Bethlehem Steel, the New York Giants, and the Newark Skeeters. They decided to enter anyway because they wanted to play. They thought it was a good time. They were suspended from the league and hit with a $1,000 fine. That time's version of the USSF, the USFA, suspended the entire league at that point because they were trying to put the pieces back together. Nobody was budging, so they said, screw it, you're all done. They kickstarted what was known as the Soccer Wars. They tried to play with less teams, putting them at economic disadvantage, and along with the Great Depression, eventually caused the league itself to fold. There were some spin-off leagues, the Eastern Soccer League and the some other leagues that I am blanking on names at the moment that tried to pop up and play as kind of what are called outlaw leagues. But they never lasted. Of course, they didn't have the financial backing or the support from the federation. So now 100 years later, we find ourselves at a similar crossroads with decisions to make. Connor, I want to ask you first, what do you think is the driving decision behind, or the driving force behind the decision?
So before I get into that, what I want to say is we should have never been in this position to start with. And maybe to your point earlier, maybe we shouldn't be necessarily tagging this to Messi's arrival, but this is exactly why you expand your TAMGAM spending so that teams have the depth to continue to play in multiple competitions. Because when you look at all the factors at play, in my opinion, I think it makes sense why MLS chose the US Open Cup to be the competition that they backed out of, as opposed to Leagues Cup. I know that there's great history with it. It's the longest competition and all that, but I was reading the article by Jeff Reuter, and there's a quote in there from the MLS Players Association executive director, Bob Foose. And he said that the US Open Cup is certainly not something that our players look forward to. He said MLS Players Association hasn't taken a formal position on the US Open Cup, but he says that his personal opinion is that it's not at the level of our players should be playing at. The venues aren't there. The facilities aren't there. And he says that the structure of the tournament isn't contributing to making MLS a better league. And I understand where he's coming from, honestly. Like, I feel like the facilities definitely are not, certainly not at the level that like MLS players are used to playing at. If it's true that the players don't look forward to playing in it, then I think that's definitely another factor. I mean, we've seen a number of times in the early rounds of the tournament, teams don't usually even play their starters anyway. It's usually like the quarterfinals where they maybe start to put their starters in. The prize money for the US Open Cup when comparing to the Leagues Cup is pretty poor. And even the production value isn't very good. I mean, I remember you telling me about the stream that you were watching. was it Flower City? I can't remember exactly, but
The
it was a
Flower City
train wreck.
Loudon, the Flower City Loudon game where there was a cut in the middle and you had two halves.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's a train wreck. So I don't, I'm definitely not happy to see them backing out of the US Open Cup. I think this could have been prevented with proper changes to the roster rules to give them more money to spend on depth so that you don't have a situation like LAFC this year where they've played 53 competitive games in 2023, which is outrageous. But once they made the decision not to change the roster rules, I understand why they would choose the US Open Cup as I'll call it sacrificial lamb here.
I will start off this entire thing. This might take a little bit. I will start this entire thing by saying I think this is the worst decision from we do a lot of history on the podcast, from a football historical outlook. It is the worst decision possibly in 100 years, in a century, when it applies to U.S. football. That being said, you can be very, very upset with a decision and also be able to rationalize why the decision was made and understand, which is where I think you're coming from. I'm very, very aligned with yours, and I still think it's a terrible decision, but it doesn't shock me. And here's where I'll go into this, right? Don Garber cited a few things that I think are worth bringing up. Firstly, the schedule congestion, right? A problem that everybody all over the world is facing because they want more money in their pockets. And by doing that, you got to trot out your teams for more games. We know this. It's a bad system because the depth is not there, as you just mentioned. Secondly, the quality of play and the conditions, stating that it is not a product that he wants the world to see and that he wasn't sad about the small audiences. Following up, saying that he was committed to working with the USSF and USL and all these leagues to find the best possible solution for the competition. And apparently, this was his idea of the best. Let's all be real. We know what this was driven by, and that is money. MLS requires money to operate, and they have a projection going out 5+ years with every decision they make, or at least they should, because that's how businesses should be run. You should have contingency plans and understanding about how your financial impact will be made with decisions that you're thinking about making, right? You don't just make decisions out on a whim and say, let's try it later. We'll see what happens. Not this business. They knew that the decision to cut the USOC was not just a schedule issue because Leagues Cup is sitting right there. And for most teams, it's a heck of a lot more games in a much shorter time. This is we're clearing the schedule by cutting the thing that makes us the least. It shouldn't be a shock to anybody. You can be outraged. You can be angry. You can be upset. Nobody's saying you shouldn't be. But if you're shocked, that's a problem to me.
You know what I wonder about this is, you know, obviously a lot of people, and obviously it's big for us as well. We have a whole like segment on MLS history, and we've already talked a number of stories about the US Open Cup.
Absolutely.
But I wonder how many fans following MLS nowadays have any tie to the US Open Cup. Like you talk about the early days, like the coffee pot game and all of that, and I'm sure that has made fans, and it's probably a very memorable thing for a lot of people. But if you're like an Atlanta fan, let's just say, like that's a team that won the US Open Cup. And I don't think that many fans, when thinking back on like the most memorable moments for Atlanta, I'm not sure many of them would that's something that would jump to their mind right away. Like obviously they're gonna think MLS Cup. That's probably the first thing that they'll ever think of. They might think of like some massive wins like the snow game in Minnesota. I just don't think that teams nowadays, and this is maybe a product of how little MLS has cared about the US Open Cup lately. I just don't think they've built a lot of history and connection to the US Open Cup. I think the veterans who've been following the league for a while definitely have a lot of history and connection with the cup. And I totally understand. I mean, we've been covering the history. I think it's obvious when you look back at the history, like how and why they have that connection. But I just don't think that connection is as easily built with the newer teams and the newer fans following the league.
It's like you're reading my notes here because my next line before you ridiculously cut me off,
Sorry.
US Open Cup brings in usually less than 5,000 fans a game. Why? Because it's played on a weekday and it's kind of shoehorned in there. Whatever. You can find out why. But the history of the competition is not understood and therefore it's not appreciated by MLS fans. Why? Well, we're 30 years old. Most of us are first or second generation soccer fans, right? This is I had to bring my dad into football. I don't know if your dad or mother or grandfather.
It's a very long working process right now.
Well, and that's my point, right? The reason why the FA Cup, Copa del Rey, the Italian Cup, I don't really know the name of it. I'm
The
sorry.
German Super Cup.
The
I don't know
German,
if that's
the
the right one.
DFK, the DFK
Yeah,
Pokal, right?
yeah.
Why are those so important? Because the parents of the kids can tell them the stories of that night in Munich, right? That night in, Goodison Park, whatever. That history has been passed down. But in the American model, when you have things coming up the way that they are and the constant ebb and flow of teams in certain areas, not to mention the massive size of the country and how you can realistically I'll use the term re-up a team in a area that is close enough to a city, but it doesn't have that same tie. Excuse me. It doesn't have that same tie as a team that's been around for 100 years and gone through 100 years of this competition. Even the teams that were, it's a 100-year competition. Very few, if any, teams have actually played in this competition for 100 years, and very few, if any of them, have had a direct line to anything past the last 30 years. So, for that reason and that reason only, it's not appreciated by the fans. And you're 100% right. And this is, and again, I don't like to tip my hat to these people. The people who complain about the way that the American soccer pyramid kills teams or teams don't survive or whatever, the reasons that they have for those teams not being around are usually pretty bad. The consequence of that is this. So tie all the insert the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia thing with the board and the crazy guy pointing at it. You can tie anything you want to this because that's the way numbers and facts work. But that to me is one of the reasons why this competition is so misunderstood or underappreciated, is because that there hasn't been a team that's constantly gone through this for the last 100 years. Just the way it is. Is it good? No. Am I happy about it? No. Is it a fact? Yeah. And we can choose to live with the fact and move on, find different ways to fix it because we have to find different ways around everything. Or we can yell, scream on Twitter and do nothing about it. So at the end of the day, the board came in and said, yep, we need to pick a competition to cut so we can lower our impact on the player's schedule. And we're going to go with USOC because the money made in Leagues Cup will help us make the desired changes in 2027 and beyond. If they come out and say that in a statement, instead of just saying, hey, by the way, we're not sending our teams, I don't think a ton of people are going to be happy, but they'll at least have some understanding of why the decision was made. Because we all know that's why the decision was made. But goodness me, just like not saying it makes you look shady. And that's what I think the biggest issue is. People are upset because the history isn't preserved and whatever. And somebody came out and said, yeah, well, American and MLS soccer Twitter isn't the entire world. And they might have a point. We'll get to that in a little bit. But here's the deal. And this is going to be my big point for this and the reason why I still think that they shouldn't have made this decision. There was a quote from the MLSPA president, and I think you mentioned it already, about how it's not a good look for MLS or MLS players don't like playing in it, blah, 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 blah. Newsflash to anybody who is following that logic. The US Open Cup is not made to make MLS or MLS players happy or better. It was here long before MLS was here. It existed long before we were even a thought. It isn't here to make the league better. That is not its sole goal. it gives so much money and attention to lower leagues that are already on their own, have to find ways to fend for themselves. The only chance to prove that they can compete with the best, and they've pulled it out and ruined it. Some notes on the numbers of that. I'm sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but this is something I really, really am passionate about in this conversation. I think it was the Birmingham Legion who came out and said their highest league ticket sale in 2022 was like 10K for a 20K stadium, whatever. When their MLS opponent came to play them in the US Open Cup, 18,000 tickets. They went and nearly doubled their ticket sales for a single game because of this. The amount of gate money, that alone, is massive for these types of clubs. The fact that they don't get to work with this is a problem. I'm going to finish by saying that, again, I 100% understand that MLS is not responsible for the growth of anything except itself. It's not supposed to grow USL. It's not supposed to grow US soccer. That's how this system works. It is a business, and the business had one job, and that was to survive. Don't make mistakes, survive. And I get the point of it, and I can rationalize it, and I can understand it. But at some point, there needs to be an understanding that history and tradition within the world of US soccer is such an important part of growing the game. If you continue to make decisions like this, where you can't set down a foundation to build history, you will never grow the game more than just a bunch of people pointing and saying, "Oh, this is a retirement league," the blah blah blah, right? I'm going to take an approach that is a little bit positive because I don't like living in a negative mindset. I try not to. I think that this is the league who came out and said that the quality is bad, the tournament's bad, blah 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 blah. I think this is them trying to strong arm a message to the federation to say put more resources into sponsorship, production, make it worth our while, and we'll come back. I think it's a terrible way to do it because I think you can influence that change without pulling out of it and jeopardizing the entire cup in and of itself. You have the resources as a league with damn near 30 clubs now to put some of it back in to make it worth your while. But you're not, you're walking away from it because you're worried about yourself and you're not worried about the history and foundation, all the things we just talked about. I find it massively disappointing. And rant for part.
I guess my question for you is, you mentioned it, like obviously MLS is its own entity. There's no pro rel, so there's not like a link. The only link between USL and MLS prior to this was the US Open Cup and just the fact that they're both leagues in the US. I guess what would be the incentive for MLS to help build these other league, like help build the USL league? What's the incentive there for them?
You're right. There is no incentive. And I'm not saying that they need to do it to build USL. What I'm saying is that they should do it because 100 years ago, the first division tried not to do it. And we lost football in this country for, I think, a decade, maybe two, before NASL before all the USISL. There's a league there that I'm missing. I'm mixing up the names because there are so many of them. But for years we went without it because it started the soccer wars, and this is something I'm actually really excited to read up on at some point because it's a very, very interesting part in U.S. soccer history. But 100 years ago, this happened, and it put us in a massive hole. Yes, the Great Depression played a part in that, but there's a history here that I truly, truly feel outweighs, and I think a lot of people feel it outweighs money. That being said, I don't know what the MLS accountant books look like. I don't know what they're swimming. I don't know what they're trying to figure out. But I really, really am disappointed with it because instead of trying to find the solution, they just turned their back and said, good luck. which I think is a really bad, it's a bad message to send to the world when your league doesn't even care about the history that it's trying to shoehorn itself into. US Open Cup and leagues existed well before MLS, and there are teams that have existed for that time. Not many, but there are. And the fact that MLS is sitting there saying, "Oh, it doesn't do any good for me, so I'm not going to do it," is a slap in the face to what has gone on the last 100 years in this country to get to a point where MLS is. And that's what disappoints me is it's a short-sighted me before we viewpoint that I think is detrimental to the growth of the game. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a me before we move. I think they are focusing on themselves and their own competitions. I think they probably saw how teams in MLS would play very rotated squads for at least a round or two. It doesn't seem like they were just committed to playing the tournament. You have the MLSPA coming out and saying that our players don't like playing in this level of competition. I mean, from a me perspective, I'm not saying that as in myself. I mean, from the me or we argument, from the me perspective, everything was saying this competition would be cut because it just doesn't seem like teams want to be there, or it doesn't seem like owners want to be there. It doesn't seem like players want to be there. So if they were going to cut a competition, it seems obvious that this would be the one versus Leagues Cup, who, and I'm sure, a lot of that was definitely very messy dependent. Like him coming in and playing and starting in Leagues Cup and having that run absolutely put way more eyes on that competition than would have happened if Messi was not there. But regardless, that competition, even outside of just Messi, we talked about it, we recapped it. It was so much fun. I thought the structure was really good. The level of competition was great. Teams were playing starters. It was competitive. Liga MX teams are like the level of competition that I would see MLS teams competing against if you want if you want MLS teams to play their best. And the prize money was way more worthwhile for teams to actually try and not just like send out a rotated squad to make sure that their guys don't get hurt. Like my concern if MLS stayed in it is that, we talk about like the history of it and creating this history and having stories to tell, like to pass on, to create these lifelong fans. I just feel like the way that MLS treated US Open Cup previously, you weren't going to get those stories. Like I can't see an Inter Miami going into round 3 and round 4 of the US Open Cup. There's almost 0% chance that Messi, Suarez, Busquets, Alba, any of those guys are playing in those games. So I just don't see how like any person who just hopped over to follow the league because Messi came over is going to care about the US Open Cup because they're going to look and they're going to be like, oh, we're just playing backups. Like Messi's not playing. None of these big names are playing. This must not matter. Like I'm not going to follow it. I don't really care. It's not like when teams play the FA Cup in England, like, maybe the earlier rounds, if they're playing like the lower level competition, they maybe they play like a more rotated squad. But I think they get to a point where they're playing, like, even if they're playing, like, if once they start playing against, maybe championship teams or other Premier League teams, you see the higher level quality player come out. And it's not just like the youth academy guys that are out there. But I feel like with the US Open Cup, even if an MLS team was playing another MLS team in like round 4, you'd still see rotated squads. I mean, some of them cared more than others, but I just think there would be a hard time creating that history if teams and players didn't care about the competition.
Here's the thing. For the majority of teams, they played their backups anyway. They played their MLS Next Pro guys anyway. Why come out and make a PR statement that mandates you do it and put yourself all the work that you've done in the last 2 years? I mean, we've been doing this now 4 seasons, nearly 3 or 4 years, and all we've seen are positive steps from. People are upset. People are always going to be upset because it's not Europe. It doesn't have, but whatever. But you've done so much work to get to this point. And now all of a sudden you're like, pop, there it goes. There are so many other ways. Jimmy Conrad put out such a good tweet about the different ways you could have handled this. roster rule changes you've mentioned, allowing teams to dictate things on their own, putting in actual resources to make the tournament better. Multiple different pathways you could have gone. And this is why I think a lot of people are upset about it, because instead of putting the work in to preserve the history, MLS turned its back. It's a gravely, that's probably not the right word. It's a massive, massive bad look. That's the way I'll put it.